I came across a really interesting example today of two things. One is the role of semantic range in translation, but the other is my oft-repeated statement that there is no random translation. No matter how odd a translation may sound, my experience is that there's always a reason for it, and sometimes you have to dig pretty deeply to find it, but there is a reason. So we know that Paul actually wrote at least four letters to the Corinthian church. What we call 1 Corinthians is second, and what we call 2 Corinthians is really fourth. But here you have in 1 Corinthians, I wrote. So there's an error, so that probably is the true 1 Corinthians. I wrote to you in the letter, probably here this is a personal possessive, in my letter, in other words, the previous one, not to associate with the sexually immoral. And then in 5:10, he points out, I'm not talking about people outside of the church. And then in verse 11, this is where it gets really interesting. But now, in the standard translation of noon, I wrote, notice it's an aorist, I wrote to you not to associate if someone, being called a brother or sister, is sexually immoral. But it's the noon and the aorist egrapsa that I want to talk about. When you say, but now, what's he referring to? Well, it may be that he's referring to the writing of what we call 1 Corinthians, really 2 Corinthians. Well, then, if he's talking about what he's writing now, why does he use an aorist? Well, that's called an epistolary aorist, right? By the time it gets to the Corinthian church, the time of writing will be in the past. And so it was common to refer to a present event, his current writing, but to use an aorist tense. So, but now and that's why you see these present tense translations. I went with I am writing, NIV, I am writing, ESV, Net Bible. So that's a perfectly legitimate translation. But notice in the CSB and in the NASB, they go back with the past tense, wrote, but what also is different? Do you see it? Yeah, they're not translating noon as now, they're translating it as actually, in which case the aorist egrapsa makes perfectly good sense. But actually, I wrote in the true 1 Corinthians that you weren't supposed to associate with people who claim to be Christians. Well, where on earth does actually come from with noon? And this is a great example of range of meaning. So as we look at BDAG, we see that noon is an adverb of time. And certainly its most common definition is now. BDAG says the temporal marker with a focus on the moment as such, in other words, now. And you can see that the vast majority of the uses of noon mean now. But here's where it gets really interesting. Definition number 2 is it's a temporal marker with a focus not so much on the present time as the situation pertained at a given moment, or in other words, now or as it is. And you notice this is where they put our verse. This is where the actually comes from. In other words, the now is not pointing to the present time that Paul is writing 1 Corinthians 5:11, but he's saying, here's what I was talking about when I wrote that. And that's where you get the actually. But actually, I wrote to you. In other words, you misunderstood me what I said, and what I wrote had to do with not associating with someone who claims to be a follower of Christ, but lives an immoral life. That's where the NASB and the CSB go. So it's actually really interesting, I think, that you have the semantic range of noon, but you also have an epistolary aorist versus a traditional aorist, past time. And it's in the combination of those two things that you have to make up your mind. Is Paul referring to what he originally meant in that first letter, or is he now writing his clarification? You can see the translations differ, but there's always a reason.